Hello, welcome back to Game Development 02. Today is about paper prototyping. I'm going to take you along on the ride for my process with Gunless Goblin, what I'm thinking about, and let's see what paper prototyping is all about. So we start with our previous game idea sentence where you're a goblin running away from racist cowboys chasing you with guns and spells. And we ended with the idea for these three systems that we could work on, right? Based on our inspiration, where we have a movement system, a drama system, and a magic food system. Now, I'm going to focus for a paper prototype. I would advise you to focus on the core of your game idea. For me, this is running away, right? The running away part is very important. So let's try and think of a paper prototype that captures that feeling of running away. So what do we need for that? We need a player, right? Our little goblin. And then we need an enemy for them to run away from, which is, the cowboy, obviously. So you can do this in a variety of ways. You could do this in an art program where, maybe you drew a little art asset and you just literally drag them around in the art program. That's something you could do. But it's easier to play it with people if you have like actual pieces of paper where you do something on. And then maybe, something I would advise doing is having some representation of distance to try and keep track, right? But basically what I did here is I just put a linear line. So the player can just move left and right, and the enemy can just move left and right. It's not even 2D here. Just to get an abstraction of the most basic concept of the game, right, which is running away. And I said, okay, let's give the player 2 steps and the enemy 1 step. And then, obviously, the player can run away faster than the enemy can catch them. And it's going to be not very interesting because the player can just keep running. So, from here, we kind of enter the stalemate, and then you want to think about adding something that prevents that stalemate. So here we are, I added another enemy, right? There's other ways you could try and prevent a stalemate, but I know that I want more than one enemy anyways. So I think this is a good moment to add another enemy. So then from here, the player doesn't have many options, right? Because they're in between 2 enemies. So they're always gonna have to face one of them. And so next step would be thinking about an encounter between the player and the enemy. Right? What could the player do to get around the enemy or distract them or throw them off their trail? Right. So here I'm just using the inspiration that I have gathered from the previous ideation process to kind of come up with ideas that would fit. Right, where maybe they can slam a door, maybe they can jump through a window, maybe they can dive off the platform that they're standing on, because I was thinking of this verticality, right? Maybe they can throw an item at them. Maybe they can do some kind of rope swing to change direction or get somewhere else that the enemy can't follow them, or maybe you can slide off a roof to get away quick, or knock over a crate, or hide around a corner. Anyway, you get the idea. Just write down a bunch of stuff for an important moment like this, but then pick one that you think adds something and that could be a core element of, the core of your game. So I'm using the inspiration here to come up with one that I think fits the most and provides the most flexibility and clarity. Where I said, okay, let's allow the player to slide off of the roofs, right? So let's think about, we had the linear line where the player can move across, but now the player can also drop down into another line. So it's like a bilinear, whatever. Anyway, you'll see. So I'm just doing this to test the flexibility of the game loop, basically. So now the player can move down, right? And the enemy can move down 1 step at a time, because we don't want the enemy to be as fast as the player, which is something you just know instinctively as a game designer from like previous things, where you want the player to be faster because that gives them more autonomy, but you want the enemy to be just more and kind of think about where the player is going, so the player has to more actively move, basically. The enemies are more reactive, passive movers than actual like parkour experts or anything. So that's the vibe I'm going for, and is why I'm doing the steps just real quick. So then we get something like this. And now here's the first interesting choice the player can optimally make, I would say, is they do one step, right? Because that's an important decision, because one step is less than two, and two you would think is always better than one, right? But I instinctively here decided as game designer, I don't think I want you to be able to move on the line and step halfway up something with your two steps. So it's just one step and then, you're kind of there. And I think this is interesting because if you do two steps, of course, you're going to get captured by the enemy. So you do one to keep your distance and kind of watch them, And then here the enemies just kind of move and you go up. Now, I would say this is kind of a stalemate, right? Because if the enemies go up, you kind of, can just go down again. Like this doesn't really threaten you at all. So we have to make a change here where, we have to make the enemy predict the ideal player movement to make it no longer the ideal move, right? So something like this, for example, where the enemies now decided to like split up and actually cut off the routes of the player, and now it's no longer ideal for the player to just keep going up and down. Now I want to do something else where we're adding more, right? Where we talked about sliding off roofs, and we talked about the enemies also being able to go up and down with, for example, ladders, right? And now I want to represent those in the prototype that we have so far, the paper prototype, and hopefully give some more depth. So here, for example, I'm thinking about, okay, the enemies have these ladders to go up and down, and the player can now only slide down the roofs and can only go up on the ladders, right? And maybe immediately you think, that's going to cause a stalemate. And potentially you'd be right, because there's two enemies and there's two ladders. So if the player goes down here, if there's two enemies down, right, then that will just cause the enemies to block the ladders, and the player can't, can just be captured on the bottom, which could be an interesting fail state, right? The player has to think about when they're going down, because they could get captured if they do it at the wrong time. But for me, it's more, I want it to be more free-flowing, and I don't want it to, keep in mind that much, because it's going to be a bigger level. So this is meant to be an abstraction of the bigger level, right? So maybe there's also a rope that the player can go up, and the enemies then, maybe can't. And this kind of brings me to my thought process on what's important for a paper prototype to keep in mind. So you want to pay attention to stalemates, as I've shown you now a couple times, where, whenever a stalemate happens, you want to think about, is this something that is going to keep happening, right? If it's something that's going to keep happening, you want to think about interesting choices for the player to do if such a stalemate happens. Like you either want to change the level or you want to change the behavior of the enemy to try and keep a stalemate from happening. Or if a stalemate happens, you want to give the player interesting choices to break that stalemate. So, for example, as I was saying, maybe you want the stalemate with the ladders so that you have the player actually think about whether they can go down or not, right? For me, that's not something I find interesting, but it could be. So I feel like these stalemates are moments for you as a game designer to think about whether that's something you find interesting and how you want to tackle that in the overall game idea. Definitely also keep in mind interesting choices, like if a choice is interesting or not. Right now, I, for example, decided that you can go down in specific spots with the sliding off the roofs, but then you can't go up again on that same spot. And I think that provides more interesting gameplay because you can't just go up and down everywhere you want. So that's something to keep in mind. And also clarity is important because this is, starting to get a little complicated, and you want to make it as easy for also paper prototype testers because they're also working on a layer of abstraction. They're not playing the actual game, of course, but also just for you as a game designer, you want to keep a clear head on what's going on and what's important. So you want to one by one add stuff. And here I purposefully added a little too much at once to show you how that kind of like clutters the scene and makes it hard for you to focus on what is adding anything, right? It makes it hard to find a stalemate even. So here I added, for example, the door slam, the jump through window thing, and you can knock over a crate. But ideally, I would say you would distill this down into one obstacle item for now, right? Like you either just do the door and then treat the door and the window kind of as the same thing, just to keep it a little more simple, or you just do the crate and just see what happens from there and then add the other things later. So just add things one by one is what I would say, um, if the system allows for it, right? If to test an idea, you need to add three things at once. Like for example, if I were to add the magic fruits, right, I would have to add the fruits and spots for where the fruits are and maybe different types of fruits to kind of see if it was worthwhile to do that idea any further, right? But in this case, I would just do one by one. So yeah, for the clarity, remember that you are focusing on the running away part. You don't want to do too much at once. You want to try and distill that down to something that works and then add on to that. So think back to inspiration, the scope that we talked about on the ideation. That's something you want to keep doing throughout this development process. And then I also want you to be mindful of a couple things with paper prototyping, where it's mostly restricted to turn-based because it's very difficult to test stuff in real time. Makes it difficult to talk about like distances or whether you would make a certain choice or not, because you have to explain a lot to a player when stuff is kind of like abstracted and unintuitive sometimes. So it's difficult to do real time. Also, paper prototyping, as I said, can sometimes be too abstract for people, so it's difficult to follow along. And as I was saying, also don't add too many choices just for the sake of it. Make sure the different choices like do something, like they actually make the player think about which choice to do, and you don't just do the same one every time. I would also call that a stalemate if the player is just doing the same thing every time. It doesn't have to be, it could be a choice, but I'm just saying be careful. And then try and slowly work it up to a full game loop. Because, we started from this, right? We slowly worked it up. You don't have to back it up, like start up big and like think of everything at once. It's very hard to do. You need a lot of experience for that. And that's why you do it like this, so that you give yourself time to think about each step. What would happen if, right? And try and do that as much as possible before you start putting too much effort into programming or designing full-on systems. Like before you decide, for example, the player speed in the programming or something, think about it in abstract ways, like how fast would you want the player to move and for what reason, right? Here I said I want the player to be twice as fast as the enemy. Maybe that's not realistic for the actual game, but it gives you a framework to think off of. All right, so thanks for listening to my paper prototype talk. I hope it helped you. And for the next times, I will probably give a talk on the software I use for game development. Also thinking of like a programming starting up kind of thing. Philosophy of learning, because I think there's a certain way to think about learning something, and I think it would be fun to um, follow along on like defining an art style. So yeah, I hope that gave you some inspiration, helped you along the way, and thanks for listening. Bye bye.